broken Hearthstone cards you forgot about. First up, we have Gibberling. Gibberling was released as a 1-mana 1/1 with Spell Burst, summon a Gibberling. Spell Burst, coming back in the newest expansion, the way it works is if the minion is in play and you play a spell, the thing listed happens. So for 1 mana, you get a 1/1 minion that when you play any spell, summons another 1/1 minion that if you play a spell, will summon a 1/1 with an active spell burst. If you play a spell, will summon another 1/1, etc. forever. So naturally, this card fit very seamlessly into aggro druid, both in standard and potentially even more so in wild. In standard, you had cards like Lightning Bloom, Adorable Infestation, Innervate, Nature Studies, Tree Enforcements, Power of the Wild, Blessing of the Agents, Savage Roar. The deck, basically was, built entirely for Gibberling. It had other cards, it had Intrepid Initiate and just other general, aggro cards. But this was one of those cards that allowed you to just go so wide and was it plus a couple spells was a wide board all on its own. Combine that with Voracious Reader and other cards at the time, and boom, you've got quite the aggro deck. However, if you go from standard, which was all of that, now to wild, not only do you still have those cards, but you also have access to pirates, which on their own are just kind of the only thing in wild that's been good enough in aggro forever. But you also have cards like Mark of the Lotus, which is an incredibly efficient card when combined with Gibberling. So you'd be able to have a board full of 2/2s or 3/3s on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, etc. And it allowed the deck, the card, the class to be very prominent for a fairly decent amount of time, but ultimately not long enough of a time that Gibberling's probably not, occupying anyone's brain space at this point. No one's triggered from Gibberling probably, as there was a lot of other cards you were probably playing at the time that you're probably more upset about. And so a lot of people may have even forgotten that Gibberling existed. And like me, may have forgotten that Gibberling was nerfed to 2 mana, which is part of why we forgot about the card. But it is now a 2 mana card instead of a 1 mana card, and it actually didn't get reverted when it rotated. It is still 2 mana, so probably never going to see the card again, but was certainly quite the card when it was dominating standard and wild roughly 3 to 4 years ago. Next up, we have one of the oldest cards on this list, Totem Golem. Totem Golem, I'm sure you probably can remember now that I'm bringing it up, but it's a card that was overshadowed in its deck and in its time of dominance. So you often think of cards like 4 mana 7/7 instead of it, when it was one of the cards that dominated aggro shaman lists for years, all throughout Mean Streets, all throughout Whispered of Old Gods, all throughout kind of Hearthstone. This card was dominating and was incredibly powerful. You're getting a 3 mana minion for 2 mana, and obviously you then have the Overload 1. But when you think about the fact that this card is the Grand Tournament set card, it's really easy to understand if you've seen any of my previous talks about the Grand Tournament cards, that there's just nothing else in the set worth playing competitively wise. And so this card and aggro shaman for years dominated, but often you'd see complaints and you'd have people having post-traumatic stress when they think about pirates or the 4 mana 7/7. Not so much Totem Golem, so it's kind of a card that we've kind of forgotten about, has kind of fallen off, kind of fell to the wayside. But this card was a powerhouse and was certainly to be respected back in its heyday. It's still one of those cards to me that's wow, this card is not good enough anymore. Interesting. But ultimately it's the Overload, which I guess makes sense. There's also just so many ways to summon free totems that you'd rather have a free 0/2 totem than a 3 mana 3/4 totem when you have 0 mana cards that can buff your totems. You just want to spam as many out there. Makes sense, but this is one of those cards that's really good and has since been forgotten about. I have many positive memories of combining this card in aggro or totem shaman decks, specifically with Totemic Reflection. Every time I'd have a Totem Golem stick and I'd see that yellow Totemic Reflection, just, chemicals would go off in my brain. It was ooh, oh yeah, baby. I'm getting 5/6 with upside twice on turn 3. It's inject that into my veins as I hit the opponent for 1/6 of their health immediately and threaten to do that 2 more times. Absolute fire. Absolute gas. I miss my pal Totem Golem. A broken card since forgotten about. Next up, we have Possessed Lackey. Possessed Lackey is a rare warlock minion that came out in the Cobalt and Catacombs set, releasing as a 5 mana, 2 attack, 2 health minion, Death Rattle, recruit a demon. This card for the most part was slept on when it was revealed and teased initially. There were a few people that were, harsh on it, but said, hey, with the right deck, it could be good. Most people just kind of saw 5 mana 2/2 and laughed, but this card ended up being actually quite a powerhouse for its time, allowing you to cheat out things like Void Lord and Doomguard for free. Combine that with cards like Skull of Minari, Blood Reaver Gul'dan, and suddenly you have quite the deck that the card requires, built entirely around big demons, throwing things like Carnivorous Cube, and suddenly you realize Possessed Lackey is not only a card that now has a deck, it is a key piece in enabling, empowering this deck to its heights. Possessed Lackey is one of those cards to me that when I look at it, I'm just kind of used to it being a 6-mana 2/2 now, because the card did get nerfed only like 5 or 6 months after it came out, a little less than 6. But looking at it like the last 6 years and looking at it now, it's crazy to me to think that this card was nerfed, right? This card is a 6-mana 2/2. If it was a 5-mana 2/2, it would be untouchable, unplayable. You wouldn't glance at this card as a 5-mana 2/2, and it's a 6-mana 2/2. It's crazy that this card hasn't been reverted or even like buffed in the caverns of time, because wild players like crave big demons, are really nostalgic for it. But yeah, this is a fever dream just looking at this card. It's like I have some memories obviously of this card being nuts, but it like so quickly was both nerfed and power crept. Not like specifically power crept in terms of like, you know, there's no 4-mana Death Rattle Recruiter Demon, but there is Skull of Lunari, and there's just like better ways to do what this was doing. But certainly a powerful card in its time, and you know, getting nerfed and then other cards doing similar things, being better coming out, is certainly a recipe for being forgotten about. But quite the guy this was. And you know, while we're at it, if you want to talk about the Kobolds and Catacombs set for Warlock specifically, talk about just like, you know, 10 hits, 1 miss. Like this set was nuts. Dark Pact, nuts. Kobold Librarian, nuts. Vulgar Homunculus, insane. Hooked Reaver, nuts. Lesser Amethyst Spellstone, nuts. So those 3 cards, even Warlock, the 2 before, are still being played and everything to this day. Possessed Lackey was good, isn't anymore. Cataclysm was terrible for like a bajillion years, and then broke the game to the point of had to be like absolutely demolished as a card. Maybe we'll touch on that more later. And then you have Voidlord and Skull of Lunari. So obviously like Skull of Lunari didn't power creep Possessed Lackey because it came out in the same set and you ran both of them, right? And so Possessed Lackey was strong on its own, but there are other ways that people kept the deck alive without Possessed Lackey. But all of those cards I just named were hits. Ran the First Disciple, a hit flavor-wise. People loved the card. Probably not that good, but like, wow, what a set, man. What a nutty set. Next up, we have Iron Deep Trog. If you're playing Hearthstone recently, well, if you started playing recently, you probably have no idea what this card even is. This is one of those cards that kind of came out in the newer era of Hearthstone, but didn't stick around very long as a result. And so, while it had like some playability, certainly after it was nerfed, it didn't have a ton. And so it very quickly became a card that was kind of nuts for a small portion of an expansion, kind of okay for a little bit, and then just disappeared. And I imagine because of that kind of short lifespan, besides those that were certainly harmed mentally by it on its release, kind of a card we've all forgotten about. Iron Deep Trog, a 1-mana 1/2 that reads, after your opponent casts a spell, summon a copy of this. So not only when you had a 1/2 out and your opponent played a spell, did you get another 1/2? If you buffed the card either in your hand or on the board, when it would summon a copy, obviously it would keep those buffed stats. So if you played Iron Deep Trog as like a 2/7 or like a 5/5, if your opponent played a spell, you'd get either a 2/7 or a 5/5, right? You'd get a copy of it. So this card quickly became an entire strategy on its own. You'd make Iron Deep Trog big in however your class or deck could, and then you'd play it out and hope that your opponent couldn't answer it, and that you could just win the game immediately, because if they can't kill one, they can't play spells. And if they can't play spells, it's gonna be really hard for them to ever come back in a game, because minions generally don't have as many comeback mechanics. Obviously with Rush and stuff, there are certainly some that do, but it's kind of integral to basically every Hearthstone deck at some point to be able to play spells. And if they can't deal one, but play a spell to kind of like force minions out to give themselves a chance, now suddenly they have 2 of them, and then you really can't play spells. And also you've just given them a free buffed minion. So this card very quickly was like insane, despite now being a card you glance past and your 1 mana as you scroll by and never actually acknowledge its existence. That is because it got nerfed to, instead of saying summon a copy, it became worded as, after your opponent casts a spell, summon another Iron Deep Trog. There was some reasons to play this still. If you were playing against a deck that was totally built on spells, and especially like non-target specific spells, you know, like if your opponent's deck was 30 arcane missiles, right, you'd love to have this card because your Iron Deep Trogs just keep infinitely resummoning themselves and the opponent can't do anything to you. In Wild, it was particularly used as like a counter to APM Mage with Flame Waker. And in Standard at the time, it kind of just lingered around because it was still kind of okay for aggro. Like even though it made 1/2s, if they gave you some 1/2s, you could then buff them. It kind of had like Gibberling at home vibes. But anyway, it's a card that quickly fell out of the public consciousness and was ultimately forgot about, despite being very broken at one point in Hearthstone's history. Next up is probably one of the cards I remember most fondly from this entire list. This card is, of course, Bone Mare. Bone Mare is a 7 mana, 5/5 battle cry. Give a friendly minion +4/+4 and taunt. When it released, it had no minion type. It is now an undead beast. That's irrelevant in terms of my memory, and really just irrelevant for the card's lifespan, basically entirely, as that was done in the last 2 years, and the card has since been forgotten about, obviously, right, as it's, being talked about in this video. But this card was a powerhouse back in the Knights of the Frozen Throne and a little bit afterward in tempo decks, right? Decks that played minions and tried to stick them. Any minion you'd play, suddenly this is like a Blessing of Kings and a minion on its own. It was very prominent in like Kaliseth rogue decks back in the day, where they would buff all their minions with Kaliseth and Shadow Step and just kind of like play out minions. And so if they ever stuck a minion turn 6 or later, you were like terrified of Bone Mare. Bone Mare was so good that after only 4 months, it got nerfed to cost 8 mana and sat that way for like 3 years before they eventually moved it down to 7. And then after like another year, they gave it Beast and Undead. But at that point, from basically 2018 onward, this card was forgotten about, despite being an absolute powerhouse for the first 4 to 6 months or whatever of its existence. A card that for most people, probably don't remember it as fondly as I do. I mean, it's just like a sort of a strong comment, but I really liked this card. It had great sounds. It felt very satisfying to land it on something. Made you feel real good about your spot in the game. You'd often be able to go face with 4+ your minion, which is always nice, and made a kind of a hard minion to kill. If you ever had more than one minion you could protect while pushing, it was a really strong card, really fun card. But I'm sure there are probably some people watching this that have never heard of this card, which I guess validates it being forgotten about. But for those who don't know, this card was actually quite good in its time. I have a lot of fond memories of it. It was just kind of a versatile card, being a neutral. You could play it just about anything that wasn't cheating out big minions, I guess, because you wouldn't want to pull a 7 mana 5/5. But if you ever played minions, you ever stuck minions, this had the potential to do some powerful things for you. Raiding Party. Raiding Party is a rare rogue spell that came out in the Rosticon's Rumble set. It reads, draw 2 pirates from your deck, combo, and a weapon. This obviously seems like it would only have 1, maybe 2 uses, but it actually had quite a bit because, the first thing you think of is, all right, pirates, draw 2 pirates from you. You're like, okay, you're going to play a pirate rogue deck, and you're going to put a weapon in it because it combo and a weapon. So you got something like Hook Scimitar, an aggressive weapon. Aggressive in this case meaning it has a lot of attack for the mana. Doesn't really have any value on top of that, but you don't care your aggro deck. You're going to play early pirates. You're going to use this card to draw more of them, as well as the Hook Scimitar. You're going to smack your opponent in the face with everything you can and hope that they die. Pretty self-explanatory. But this card actually, beyond that, stuck around for a long time because pirates just in general in Hearthstone is the strongest tribe for the most part, especially in Rogue, certainly. But generally, just for most of Hearthstone's lifespan, pirates have been the strongest tribe, across the board. Whether it was aggro or just tempo mid-range, or just there used to be control decks back in the day that would play South Sea Captain Apaches because it was just so strong. That's how good pirates were for most of Hearthstone's lifespan. And so this card stuck around in lots of different decks, and another one of the key uses of it was actually in Kingsbane Rogue. When Kingsbane came out, you'd play a shell with either aggro pirates plus Kingsbane and weapon buffs. So you just take out the Hook Scimitar, put in the Kingsbane, throw in some weapon buffs, and you have yourself a deck that can ship with pirates and then ultimately finish off with huge Kingbane's weapons over and over and over again, until eventually Rogue got better draw, better weapon tutors, and this card, while a lot of people were like, oh yeah, Raiding Party, I remember playing that in Aggro Rogue or Kingsbane Rogue or Scimitar Rogue, they're like, oh yeah, that card exists, because they had forgotten about it because of better efficient draw, such as Mic Drop, which, since we had moved on, Kingsbane wasn't really playing as many pirates, drawing 2 cards was not a drawback on that, and the finale of giving your weapon attack had potential. And so now that you had enough ways to tutor your weapon, this card, as well as things like Gear Shift and stuff, just completely relegated Raiding Party to the sidelines and quickly became not needed, not usable, and forgotten about. Back to strong neutral minions that once dominated, and now you're like, oh, that's a card, yeah. Huh. We have Giggling Inventor. Giggling Inventor releasing as a 5 mana minion that read Battle Cry, summon 2 1 and 2 mechs with Taunt and Divine Shield. So in other words, Battle Cry summoned 2 Annoyatrons. They just didn't want you to have to know what an Annoyatron was, so they told you what it was. But it literally summoned Annoyatrons. And in the lore, the gnome is a maker of Annoyatrons, as well as in the art you can see an Annoyatron being made. She may even be the original constructor of the construct of an Annoyatron. I don't know. She might be the one mentioned in Annoyatron's flavor text. I'm no lore guy, but that seems to be what the consensus is here. It's pretty cool. Kind of funny that the inventor of Annoyatron would be giggling while doing so. That's kind of funny. The card seems underwhelming. It seems like something you'd be like, why is this good? It's a 5-mana 2/1, and you're getting two drops that are like okay, like they're Annoyatrons, and not like putting up pressure. But this card was like the definition of a taunt wall in neutral. Right, you have memories of things like Tar Creeper or Ziliax that were just strong neutral taunt minions. There's almost something about that, like a meta is healthier when there's a strong neutral taunt minion. This was the version of that came out in the Boomsday Project set. However, this one, somehow, despite only being a 5-mana 2/1 and summoning Annoyatrons, was actually really, really powerful. So powerful, in fact, that after only 2 months of this card being in standard, they had to increase its cost, not to 6, but to 7 mana. You are now paying 7 mana for a 2/1 and the pleasure of also creating 2 Annoyatrons. That's crazy, but that's just how good it was. And because it got nerfed so fast, most people probably have forgotten about it. And even when it rotated, I believe, or at least when Ashes came out, I think that's when a lot of things rotated, it went from 7 down to 6. But even when it went to Wild, they didn't feel comfortable pushing it to 5, which is crazy. Today it could certainly be 5, but I guess at the time, better safe than sorry, maybe. I don't know. It's like, without, like, if you're just listening, it's hard for me to explain to you why this card was good. You kind of have to look at the footage, but like basically it was just like back in the day where Hearthstone had a lot more minion board-based ways of winning and finishing, and less like spells and over the top and like other type of alternative strategies. It was really irritating to have to get through 2 Annoyatrons, like, to then even be able to deal with what they had on the board before that was played, right? Like if they have a couple minions stick and they play a Giggling Inventor, they are now like so far ahead. And like, even if you are a deck that has a big AoE, you're not killing the Annoyatrons. And if you're like any other board-based deck, you're not going to have that kind of stuff. You're going to have your own minions and your own things to do. So it just kind of dominated. Like, think of Arena, right? Where it's like minion versus minion. That was kind of what Standard was like at the time. So this was a card that was in like basically every deck and was like so powerful in terms of protecting what you had and preventing your opponent from interacting and kind of making the attacks and trades that they want. So ultimately it turned out to be very broken, but because it got nerfed so fast and because, you know, it kind of also got power crept, I guess, it kind of just fell off. And Hearthstone kind of changed to being more interesting than, I guess, just minions v minions, although obviously a lot of us have very fond memories of those days where we feel like minions mattered more, but really there's just more ways to play the game now. So ultimately, Giggling Inventor, despite being once broken, has since been forgotten about. Back to Weapon Rogue we go, and back to the Knights of the Frozen Throne set. Leeching Poison. Leeching Poison releasing as a 2-mana card. Give your weapon lifesteal. Innocent enough, right? Lifesteal's existing. It's come out now. Cool new mechanic. Give Rogue a way to use a new mechanic on a weapon. Fine, right? Fair and dandy. That was until, of course, you know, Kingsbane came out, right? Kingsbane, bit of a problem with this card. And specifically Kingsbane with all of the additional attack buffs that had come out, as, you know, giving your weapon attack is like a core rogue identity. Eventually you get to the point where you have too many of those, and you get to a point where you have a Kingsbane weapon that is like 11 attack and has 3 durability and has lifesteal, and like, of course, Kingsbane, when it breaks, goes back into your deck. So you have an unlimited amount of swings of like 10 plus attack with lifesteal. So not only are you just like killing your opponent, but you're like basically unkillable. You're a raid boss at this point. It's like every turn you power blast your opponent in the face and heal for 10. It's like that Warlock snake on steroids, and you just get it for free every turn. So at some point, you know, a year and 4 months or something is all it took for enough critical mass to be reached. They eventually nerfed the card as a result of that critical mass, and they actually buffed it first. Not really, it was in the same time, but one of the 2 changes was a buff. They made it only cost 1 instead of 2. But the actual substantial and important part of this is the nerf that says, give your weapon lifesteal this turn. So instead of being a 2-mana card you'd play at some point in the game and have permanent raid boss unkill ability, you now have a 1-mana heal for 10 type thing, which is still very, very good at this point because of how strong Kingsbane is, but certainly not broken. And while it's probably still played, you know, there's not a lot of Kingsbane going on. There's not a lot of Weapon Rogue going on. The 2-mana version, I had forgotten about even when recording this until I realized that it says now cost 1 down for 2 on the wiki. So I even forgot this card used to cost 2. But anyway, I certainly don't remember the days, thankfully, very well of having to deal with this card. Permanent lifesteal, like I got a couple in there in the back of the brain, but this card was obscene, and I'm glad they didn't revert it when it rotated. I think it's in a good spot now where it's a really good heal, kind of annoying. Maybe I'd like it to even just be gone, but thankfully for me, it is a broken card. that can be safely forgotten about. Maybe it's a stretch to say this card is forgotten about because it is still seeing periodic play over the years in Kingsbane Rogue, but I forgot it even cost 2. And I think a lot of people, if they're not like hyperactive in WoW, don't see a lot of it and have forgotten that this card once was literally that absurd as to forever give your Kingsbane lifesteal forever. Like it was absurd. One of the strongest things you could assemble in Hearthstone is just a constant state of being able to deal 10+ damage a turn and heal for that much. Really hard to beat. Next up is a card that like is on here partially because it's forgotten about, certainly, but also because it's funny. Like, I like the idea of being able to say this card was broken because, like, for those who do remember it, I think you remember this as a meme card. It's one of those cards like Possessed Hockey where thinking about it being nerfed is a fever dream because it's like, what? That card's a big fat meme. How could this have ever been strong enough? How could this ever be broken to the point it had to be nerfed? The card I'm talking about is Spiteful Summoner. Yeah, that Spiteful Summoner, that card. Spiteful Summoner was nerfed. It dominated at one point, which is tough to even think about. Pretty crazy to even think about. Spiteful Summoner, 6 mana, 4/4, Battle Cry. Reveal a spell from your deck, kind of like the Joust mechanic. Pops out a spell, shows it to everybody, and then it summons a random minion with the same cost. So if it pulls out an Innervate, it summons a Wisp, right? Something like that. But if it pulls out Ultimate Infestation and shows that to everybody, it summons a 10-drop, which obviously you could tell you'd rather run a deck with Ultimate Infestations and not with Innervates, right? Pretty self-explanatory. I mean, this was why it was a meme though, is because you had to run a deck that could only run spells that cost like 7 or more. And so it was kind of those things you do for fun, but you'd lose so many games and you'd fall behind in so many games because you only had minions in the 1 through 7 and usually 1 through 9 slots. And so it was really tough to compete with decks that had access to spells and minions, because you're cutting off most of the class from being able to be played, right? You can't play any of the spells. However, you know, 6 months after this card came out, and keeping up with, you know, all the nerfs around 2017, 2018, it was about half a year before anything ever got nerfed, which is improvement from the years before that, but I digress. The card was so strong at a point in Standard within decks that used only 10 mana spells, because in Standard, the pool of 10 mana spells was, or the pool of 10 mana minions rather, was so small that you really consistently, not necessarily hit specific minions, but you consistently hit good minions. You should consistently hit powerful minions that made this a 6 mana, 4/4 plus 10/10 or something with an effect, right? You weren't summoning just a vanilla 10/10 or even a vanilla 6/6 or something. Like, you weren't getting no 1/1 that has like an insane battle cry, right? You were getting like stats with an effect consistently to the point that this card was broken, which is hilarious to me. Because this card's such a meme, but it was nerfed for years until it rotated around Descent of Dragons, or maybe just before. It doesn't really matter. It was nerfed in Boomsday, unnerfed in Descent of Dragons, and like, I think it's still probably a stretch to call this card broken. I'm kind of doing it because I like this card. I want to talk about it, but like, it got nerfed. It was objectively problematic, at least somewhat, for a period. But even in my head, like, knowing that and knowing the reason and like having played it with 10 mana cards and Druid, and like, I can't imagine this is anything but a meme in my head. It's like so easily forgotten about for anyone who plays like competitively at all, and it's so funny to think this was a broken card. So that's why it's on here. Great card, sweet card. I have a legendary clip with this card. Just great championship level RNG. It was a good time. Maybe it's playing on the screen right now. I probably will, honestly. I'll probably sneak it in here at the end. Super old stream clip of me summoning the nuts with this card, not paying attention to it all what I summoned, and not getting punished in any way, and just getting super rewarded because I was the best. I was the nuts. I love this card, dude. I have so many good memories with this card. So of course I have to throw it on here as a broken card that we've forgotten about, because the fact that they got nerfed is hilarious. Last but not least, we have a serious card. This one on here for real. Spirit Claws. Spirit Claws is a common shaman weapon from the One Night in Karazhan set. 1 mana, 1 attack, 3 durability. Has +2 attack while you have spell damage. This came out in a time where every shaman deck had a reason to run Blood Mage Thalnos because of things like Maelstrom Portal, Brackle, Lava Shock, etc. Adding in Spirit Claws, Blood Mage Thalnos plus hitting the high roll of the spell damage totem became an insanely powerful swing when a shaman would do that, because suddenly this is a 1 mana 3/3 weapon, which you equip on turn 1, you play your spell damage minion on 2, or you hero zero power into it, you just get so far ahead so quick. And then your 0-2 totem with spell power is like, you have to kill it. Normally it's like they play a totem, you're like, oh, nice, they passed their turn. But if they hit spell power, you like basically lost the game. Like, it was crazy, because now they have a 1-mana 1/3 weapon, and their spells are going to have upside if they have any reason to play them at all. As a result, Aggro Shaman at the time, anything kind of similar to Aggro Shaman at the time, had to be brought down, and they chose to make this card cost 2. And eventually, 4 years after, when they did reverts in the Barrens, they made it cost 1 again. So it's back in its original form. And then, you know, part of why we forgot about it is part of it because, like, there's other weapons and you're doing other things. Maybe a lot of even Shaman might be the reason too. But they also just, like, for a while removed spell damage from Shaman, right? Like, it's crazy to think about, like, Shaman for years not having spell damage totem. I'm saying that out loud now and I'm like, is that the one they got rid of for strength totem? Is that real? Did that happen? But like, it totally did. They got rid of spell damage totem because of how powerful it was compared to the other options. And then it got to the point where the new one they added, the strength totem to replace it, became the strongest one in the options. And so when they got rid of strength totem to add back spell damage totem on the 10-year anniversary, it actually nerfed all of the totem Shaman decks at the time, which is really, really funny. But yeah, this is a super good example of a broken card we forgot about. It was really, really strong. Like 8 years ago, 7 years ago, it got nerfed and kind of just the whole class identity changed, right? No more spell damage totem. And so this card has since been forgotten about, despite being a 1-mana 1/3 weapon that could be a 1-mana 3/3 weapon. If you enjoyed this video and you want me to talk about broken cards you've forgotten about more, let me know in the comments below. And if you like my videos, you like hearing about Hearthstone history, don't forget to subscribe.